but they were not interested to do what they were doing in Poland. But what was about the Russia?
Very clear. Poland was on our side. Russia was on the other side. Remember the mentality of the Cold War. Poland was a captive country under the Soviet domination. Now it was free. We grab Poland to our side. By 1999, Poland had become a member of NATO. And also, even politically, there were many, many Polish Americans in the United States and voters also. So this was a natural constituency politically, of course, to help Poland. Also, Poland is a Catholic country, and Pope John Paul II was Pope. So this was, freedom for our people. But Russia, psychologically, geopolitically, was viewed, that's the other side. That's the mystery of deep Asia. That's tyranny and despotism. Even though Yeltsin was saying, look, we want a normal economy. We want a normal relationship with the United States. We want to end the Cold War. We're done with the Soviet era. It didn't matter. There wasn't the imagination in the U.S. to say, we can do something different. I tried. I think it was, it required a viewpoint. The other thing that happened was the real U.S. right wing came to the dominance, which was strange because you would have thought at the end of the Cold War, people could move to the center. But actually, what we call the neoconservatives really came to the forefront then saying, now we're alone. We're the most powerful. We can do everything. We're the unipolar world. And they created the mindset that now the United States can clean up all this mess after the end of the Cold War, even by overthrowing the governments in the Middle East that were allied with the Soviet Union or with Russia. It's not an accident that the United States went to war in Iraq, in Syria, and in Libya in the next 20 years, because those were three countries that had been allied with the Soviet Union. And the idea was now we clean up the mess left behind so that we install U.S.-friendly countries in these places, U.S.-friendly governments in these three countries. So that was the mindset. It's a kind of crazy mindset. Of course, those three wars were disasters. The Iraq War broke up the country, divided the world. The intervention in Syria to overthrow Assad failed completely, and President Assad is still there. The U.S. is mostly out. And then in Libya was the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, but it left behind a civil war. So each time the U.S. intervened, it was a mess. But it's not an accident, those three countries. Those were the three Soviet allied countries, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, and Muammar Gaddafi, and the United States went after all three of them.
Professor Sachs, we know that right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Clinton, we know when Yeltsin got elected, front page Time magazine, it was his photo. But Clinton, right after the collapse of Soviet Union, start expanding NATO, and I want to know what was the Yeltsin's reactions in those days.
Well, the timing is interesting because in 1990, as part of the end of the Cold War, the United States and Germany promised to Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And this is in the U.S. archives. There's a nice collection online that shows all of the promises that were made by the United States and Germany to Gorbachev. So it was clear to the U.S. and Germany, to Helmut Schmidt, that you couldn't just end the Cold War without making a reciprocal promise to Gorbachev that if Gorbachev would and the Soviet military alliance, which was called the Warsaw Pact, then the United States military alliance, NATO, would not take advantage of that. So that was the promise. But I think already by 1992, with Gorbachev gone from power, the neoconservatives started thinking, we don't really have to honor that. Then Clinton came in, and for the first couple of years, I don't know what they were saying internally, but it was not a live issue. And actually, there was an attempt of NATO and the Russian military to form a kind of trusted relationship. But then, starting really in 1995, 96, the policy of the Clinton administration became to expand NATO. And exactly why that is not clear to me. But I can say the first thing is they thought they could. You know, the U.S. is the superpower, can do what it wants. So part of it is just arrogance. Then they said, any promises we made to Gorbachev, forget it. Gorbachev's gone, Soviet Union's gone. But that's also not true because Russia is the continuation state of the Soviet Union. You make a promise to one, you're supposed to honor your promise to the continuation state. So they cheated on that. We had a pretty hardline Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, from Central Europe. Well, she wanted to move NATO to Central Europe. And Clinton had a debate inside his cabinet. The defense secretary at the time, William Perry, was against NATO expansion. Madeleine Albright was for NATO expansion. Clinton chose NATO expansion. Perry thought, maybe I should resign. He wrote about it in his memoirs. Even a dozen years or 20 years later, he was wondering, should I have resigned? He wasn't sure that he did the right thing. He stayed in office, but they went ahead with the NATO expansion. So it was actually in 1999 that Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO. I think even that break was not decisive for what happened because those three countries are in Central Europe. They don't border the Soviet Union. They had been occupied by the Soviet Union for decades. One could even imagine the Russians being quite unhappy, which they were, but realizing they're not going to be able to push the point more. But then George W. Bush Jr. came into power in January 2001, and he really accelerated this. So 7 more countries joined NATO during the Bush period. And these were pretty provocative because it was 3 Baltic states, part of the former Soviet Union and right on the Russian border, and 2 countries in the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria, and also Slovenia and Slovakia. Okay, this was already, Putin was getting pretty furious and saying, you're crossing our neighborhood, you're crossing our red lines. And what about all the promises once upon a time you made? But the real coup de grace came in 2008 when Bush, in his last year of office, insisted that NATO commit to enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. And then Putin said, you must be kidding. This is our immediate backyard. This is more than 1,200 kilometers of border, and you're talking about putting a military alliance up against our border. This is where our naval fleet is in the Black Sea, and you're talking about surrounding us with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia in the Black Sea, and our port, our naval port, Sevastopol in Crimea. So he said, no. And he said to George W. Bush Jr. in 2008, you expand NATO to Ukraine, Russia will take back Crimea. He already told him, you're crossing the line on this. And then a pro-Russian president was elected in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was seeing, my God, our country's in between these two superpowers. So Yanukovych said, we go for neutrality. We don't want to be members of NATO. We don't want to be a war zone. So the Ukrainian parliament adopted neutrality, and it was a little quiet. And in late 2013 and early 2014, a mass uprising took place called the Maidan Revolution, and the United States played a role in stoking it. It was partly popular, partly U.S. driven. We can't tell exactly the dynamics, but definitely the U.S. meddled, as it does. Definitely there was some natural politics to it, but the upshot of it was that Yanukovych was overthrown, and the new government that came in was an all NATO, all Europe, we're going for the West, and that's when Putin took back Crimea, and when the war started.
It was after the overthrow, the government.
Of course. It was provoked by the overthrow directly, not even any question. You overthrew our pro-Russian president. We can't tolerate this. Now you've crossed the line for our national security. And they organized a referendum in Crimea, and a Russia-backed insurgency began in eastern Ukraine, which was predominantly or heavily Russian-speaking people. And that's really when the war started in 2014. So it didn't really start in 2022. It started in 2014, immediately after the insurrection-led overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych.
Well, the things we have to understand is we have to go back even further. The United States has been seeking the destruction of Russia since the end of the Cold War. We do not want a strong Russia. We want to keep Russia down. That's why the United States reneged on its promise not to expand NATO. Almost immediately, once Gorbachev left office, the United States began the process of expanding NATO, even though we promised the Soviet Union that we would not do so. And those promises carried over to Russia. Even Boris Yeltsin, who pretty much a hand-picked American stooge, protested against the expansion of NATO because, he knew his generals weren't happy. Nobody was happy. He said, why are you expanding NATO? This is bad for Russia. It makes me look bad when I say I want to cooperate with the United States. Bill Clinton ignored him. George W. Bush ignored all, Gorbachev, Putin after that. Russia could say, we don't want this expansion, but the expansion occurred no matter what. In 2008, NATO had a summit meeting in Bucharest, I believe. And at that time, they made an announcement that said, we want to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And Russia said, this is a red line. They said, we can't allow this to happen. The U.S. ambassador to Russia at that time, a guy named William Burns, today he's the CIA director, he wrote a memorandum. The title of it was Niet means Niet. No means no. And what he was saying is when the Russians say no about Ukraine joining NATO, they mean no. It is a red line. And he warned people that if we continue to go down this path, Russia will invade Ukraine and Ukraine will lose the Crimea and the Donbass. This memorandum was written in February 2009. William Burns knew then what would happen. He wrote this memorandum to the National Security Council, to the President of the United States. Who was president at that time? Barack Obama. He ignored the warning. They instead decided that they were going to embark on a policy of regime change. Now, they didn't call it that. They called it reset. You remember the Russian reset, the nice, beautiful yellow box with the red button and the misspelled word? Yeah. But what did reset mean? Reset means we're willing to work with Russia as long as it's led by Dmitry Medvedev. Because in 2008, Putin's second consecutive term as president expired. Constitutionally, he could not continue to be president. but he knew that Russia wasn't ready for a democratically elected person because the United States was buying off the opposition. So he entered an arrangement with Medvedev, who was prime minister, and they switched places for a 4-year term. The United States wanted to exploit this, to go to Medvedev and say, look, you're president. Why don't you stay president? Why don't you kick Putin out of power? You stay president and we'll do anything you want us to do. But what they're really saying is, why don't you stay president and become weak like Boris Yeltsin so we can return Russia to the 1990s, subservient to the will of the United States. Medvedev didn't fall for the bait. Putin was reelected. And from that point on, the United States entered into an active policy of regime change, manifested itself in February of 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, or coup, in Kiev, where they ousted the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, replaced it with this revolutionary government dominated by ultra-nationalist Nazis, the right sector, Sloboda, people who worship Stepan Bandera and the odious ideology that he embraces, came into power, and they began the immediate persecution of Russians. Remember Putin's speech, 2005. Russians were homeless. Russians were disenfranchised. And now it's playing out in front of his very eyes as ethnic Russians are being burned to death in Odessa, being persecuted in the Donbass, run over by tanks, raped, murdered. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't intervene and go to war. He did provide military assistance, but he was looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. Trust me, if Russia wanted to absorb the Donbass, they did absorb Crimea because historically it is Russia, and they just weren't going to give that strategic base in Sevastopol to the Ukrainians in NATO. So they took Crimea. Ukraine opposed, NATO opposed, United States opposed. But when it came time for Donbass, which is very strategic, by the way, lots of minerals, coal, etc., they declared independence and they said, we'd like to become part of Russia. And Putin said, no, you're part of Ukraine. We have to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But what we will do is work diplomatically with the French and the Germans through something called the Normandy format. They came up with the Minsk II agreement. Ukraine signed on to that agreement. It wasn't forced on them. They signed on to it. But when the Ukrainians came back, these Nazis told their leadership that if you ratify this, if you do this, we will kill you. We will hang you by the neck until dead. We will give you a new Maidan. And so they didn't ratify it. But now we found out another reason why they didn't. Petro Poroshenko, former president of Ukraine, the man who famously or infamously gave a speech where he said, Ukrainian children will go to kindergarten and school. Russian children will hide cowering in their basements while we shell them. And for 8 years, Ukrainians did shell the Donbass. 14,000 people dead, many of them civilians, many of those people children. When the people say Putin started this war on February 24th, no. Ukraine started this war by oppressing the Russians and then spending 8 years shelling them. But it wasn't just Ukraine, because as Poroshenko said, Minsk II was a sham. It was never going to be implemented. It was a smokescreen so that Ukraine could buy time to have their army rebuilt by NATO so that they would be able to forcibly retake Ukraine. And that rebuilding process began in 2015 when the United States built a permanent training facility on Ukrainian soil where every 55 days we trained 1 battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards and then shipped them off to the Donbass to kill Russians. We bragged about it. So for 7 years, we trained Ukrainians to kill Russians. We built up this army. And what we saw in late 2021, early 22, the Ukrainians started to mass these forces in eastern Ukraine. Anywhere from 60 to 100,000 were massed, ready to launch an attack that was going to begin in early March. Indeed, prior to that, they'd begun escalating their artillery bombardments of the Donbass positions, something that's registered in the OSCE observers who were there. They noticed that the increase in bombardment, a dramatic increase, not a little increase. Now, here we are talking about war. What was Russia talking about? Peace. Russia wanted a peaceful resolution. Russia wanted Minsk to be ratified. What did Minsk II do? It required the Ukrainian government to simply modify their laws so that the Russian language and Russian culture would be respected in the areas where Russians lived. It didn't say that Donbass was going to become independent. No, it said the exact opposite. Donbass was going to be part of Ukraine. But it did say within the Donbass and other Russian-dominated areas that these laws that suppressed Russians would not apply, that they would be waived for the Russian areas. That's not asking a lot, but the Ukrainians wouldn't do it. The Russians begged over and over and over again, ratify, ratify, ratify. Indeed, if you take a look at the militias in the Donbass, they began reducing their numbers, going to a near peacetime footing, even though they're being shelled every day, because they said there's no reason for us to maintain this large fighting force if we're looking for a peaceful solution, which is another reason when the Ukrainians built up their forces, 60 to 100,000, the total number of troops in Donetsk and Lugansk was 10,000, no more. So we're talking about a 6 to 10 to 1 advantage. They were going to roll in and capture it. Russia pleaded to the United States to implement this. In June of 2021, Putin met with Biden in Geneva. And one of the things they talked about was the need to implement, and Biden promised that he would get on it, told the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, get this thing moving. But they didn't mean it because Blinken met, didn't do anything. In November, the Russians met with the French and the Germans and asked them straight up, are you going to implement Minsk? And they said no. And that's when Putin realized that this was a sham, that it wasn't point. He made one last effort in December. On December 17th, they promulgated 2 draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which talked about a new European security framework, et cetera, and the resolution of the Ukraine crisis through permanent neutrality and the implementation of Minsk II. Nobody wanted to talk about it. He had no choice. On February 24th, confronted with the reality that nobody wanted a peaceful solution to this, confronted with the reality that this NATO army that had been trained was massing, they started their shelling. They had the plans to show they were going to start attacking in early March. Under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Putin implemented preemptive self-defense. It's a right inherent in international law. One only needs to look up the Caroline Affair, I believe of 1836, 38, somewhere around there. And it applies to this day. When a threat is manifesting itself of an imminent and urgent nature, a nation doesn't have to wait to be attacked. They're allowed to preemptively respond. And that's what Russia did. They preempted the Ukrainian assault on the Donbass. That's what happened. This isn't Vladimir Putin, his brutal aggression, unprovoked aggression. No, the Russians tried everything possible to seek a diplomatic solution to this. It was the West that ignored them. The West that was seeking violence. The West was seeking violence. That's what everybody needs to understand.
Scott, do you think that in the what was happening in the mind of Biden's administration? Because I think they were thinking that they're gonna defeat Russia so easily. They will, because how if you're not thinking that you are able to defeat Russia, why would you go to war with Russia?
Well, I don't think they started out to go to war with Russia per se. I believe the United States, together with their European allies, believed that massively sanctioning the Russian economy would cause so much political difficulty for Vladimir Putin inside Russia that he would have no choice but to stop the military action and withdraw from Ukraine in defeat. It wasn't so much that NATO, the United States, and Ukraine was going to militarily defeat Russia, is that we were going to politically defeat Russia, sanction Russian economy, including the energy sector, bankrupt the Russian economy, devastate the Russian society, enforce a popular movement that led to a Moscow Maidan, a revolution that ousted Vladimir Putin. That was the goal. That was the objective. That was the hope. It backfired. Of course, Russia not only was not disrupted meaningfully by the sanctions, Russia prepared for this, had a plan for it, and they reversed it on the West. It's now the West that's being destroyed, especially Europe being destroyed by the impact of the sanctions. The lack of Russian gas is destroying European economies. So they failed. Now they were in a desperate situation because Russia wasn't going to be defeated economically. Now they have to figure out a way to defeat Russia militarily. And they do that by supplying Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of military equipment, underwriting the Ukrainian economy, again, with billions of dollars of monetary infusions. And the goal here isn't to have Ukraine win. The goal is basically to hurt Russia so badly that Russia would never again try to undertake something of this nature. The United States, sadly, is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And that's a tragic statement because the Ukrainians have not shown a willingness to give up. So they're willing to fight. Tens of thousands more will die on top of the tens of thousands who have already died, but it's in a losing cause. Russia's not going to lose this war. Russia's winning and Russia's going to win.
We see a drastic change in Putin's vision since he took power to present time. Why he changed his vision? Because his vision is so nationalist. It's all about nationalism. Why he changed his vision toward West?
Well, that wasn't Putin's decision. He tried to reach out to the West. He tried to join NATO. He bought into the idea of George H.W. Bush that there could be a Europe whole and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Now, he was turned down. Why was he turned down? Well, the short answer is that unless you have an enemy as believable as the Russian enemy has been made out to be, then you can't produce and you cannot sell arms, and then you can't get rich like our oligarchs. Now, I just saw a figure indicating that one of our oligarchs is making 15,000 times as much as the normal worker in that establishment. That's egregious. That's obscene in my view. But there are people making a lot of money, and most of the people in the United States are not making a lot of money, but are beginning to suffer almost as badly as the Russians did in the 90s under Yeltsin, who was supported by the West. I mean, it was very lucrative business to plunder the old Soviet economy. And when he was in danger of not being reelected in 1996, guess what we did? We, the United States, not me. The IMF, the World Bank, they all jumped in and gave his campaign all kinds of money, and we gave him all kinds of advisors. He was reelected after really falling really short at the polls, and the cover of Time magazine shows Yeltsin with an American flag saying, "Well, we did it. We won again." What I'd like to make clear is that Vladimir Putin was there, okay? He watched all this. It is nothing short of a miracle that Yeltsin himself appointed Putin to take his place. Now, this is guesswork in terms of human nature, but I kind of think that Yeltsin felt very, very guilty of what he had done to his fatherland or his motherland, and decided, well, this is a bright guy. If anybody has any hope of undoing the damage that Yeltsin did, it's Putin, so let him be president. That's the way I guess it worked out. I don't know any other reason why Yeltsin, the totally corrupt person, the drunk that he was, would make the right decision in this one instance, and I do consider it a right decision.
I see. And how about the Putin's vision? He changed his vision based on what? Because he came after Yeltsin. He tried to negotiate with the West. He tried to join NATO. In all his attempts, he failed. He couldn't join NATO. He couldn't negotiate.
Yeah, well, when you say in all these attempts he failed, well, if you look at it the other way, he tried, but it wasn't his fault that he failed. Let me give you an example here. In 2013, there was a false flag chemical attack outside of Damascus in Syria. False flag because it wasn't the Syrian government as our Secretary of State, John Kerry, claimed, it was people that had brought this sarin gas in from Turkey. These were the insurgents. They were blamed. The attacks were blamed on the Syrian government, and all of the so-called neoconservatives wanted Obama to start another war, this time with Syria. Look what they did. The Syrians had poisoned all those people just outside of Damascus. Now, Obama was a little bit smarter than he had been way back when he was elected, and he didn't want to start another war. Every one of his advisors says you have to. That was a red line. You've got to start this war. We got these Tomahawk missiles. They're ready to fire. We can take out the Syrian government. You got to do it. What happened? Well, by chance, by coincidence, Obama was due up in St. Petersburg for an economic summit. And so he met with Mr. Putin at the time. And what Putin told him is, I know, and I applaud your not wanting to start another war. I've got a solution for you. Now, Obama was alone. He didn't have John Kerry with him. So he was able to talk frankly with his counterpart, Russian President Putin. So he said, what's this deal? And Putin said, look, we've talked to the Syrians. They're willing to destroy all the chemical weapons that they have. They're very old, they're decrepit, but they're willing to destroy it under UN supervision on a U.S. ship outfitted for the precise reason of destroying chemical weapons. So, Obama, how do you know that? Putin, we've been working with the Syrians. Watch the Syrian foreign minister tomorrow on TV. Syrian foreign minister says, we're ready to give up all our chemical weapons under UN supervision and have them destroyed. Obama says, wow, that means I don't have to start another war. Putin said, yeah, right. Obama goes back and he faces into the neocons and he says, this is a solution. I don't have to strike out against Syria, and I'm not going to. Later, 2 years later, Obama brags to his biographer, I didn't go by the Washington playbook. I defied them and didn't start a war. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, they worked something out one-on-one, and it prevented a war. That's big, okay? So Putin writes an op-ed. It appears in the New York Times on the 12th of September, right in the midst of all this, but after they had agreed that this would be the solution. What does he say? He says, I applaud the growing trust that exists between our two countries and also between myself and President Obama. But there's one thing I have to disagree with him on, and that is that some countries, like the U.S., are exceptional. President Obama just said this last week, says Putin in this op-ed, and I disagree. I think all countries are equal. I think some are closer to democracy, some others are farther away, some are big, some are small. But when God looks on countries, he considers them all equal, period, end quote. Wow. Now, remember, that's September 12th, 2013. I described that as the apogee, the high point of Russian-U.S. relations for the last couple of decades. What happened? Well, there are people that don't want decreased tension with Russia. The people who build the arms, sell the arms, get rich by selling the arms, and the people who, for whatever reason, consider Putin and the Russian people in a kind of racist way, just next to the devil in evilness, okay? What did they do? Well, it took them 6 months, but they orchestrated a coup in Kiev, Ukraine, on the 22nd of February, 2014. No one can doubt that they orchestrated this coup It was the most blatant coup in history. Why? Because it was advertised on YouTube 2.5 weeks before it broke out. When YouTube played on the 4th of February 2014 an intercepted conversation where Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, was talking to her ambassador in Kiev, the U.S. ambassador there, plotting the coup, naming the names of the people who would take the prime ministership and other posts. Yats is the guy, she said. Yats being Yatsenyuk. What happened to him? Well, after the coup, he became prime minister, okay? And then the coup de grace here at the end, Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador the U.S. had in Kiev at the time, says to his superior, Victoria Nuland, and this is all in the Intercept, verified as legitimate, authentic. What are we going to do about the EU, the European Union? They're not going to like this. And Nuland says, F, the F word, like it's got 4 letters, F the EU. Now, she says one other thing. To get this coup glued together and the new government we're installing widely recognized, we need an international personage. So I, Victoria Nuland, have just talked to Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan is National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. And he tells me, says Victoria Nuland, that Biden's willing to come and sew this thing up and give us imprimatur to it. So he's ready. If we need him, then we have an international personality, the vice president. His name is Biden. So that's how far it went. That's all in the video, all in the intercepted conversation that was put on YouTube on the 4th of February 2014. The coup came on the 22nd. So I kind of thought, well, I know a little bit about coups, and this one's been blown, right? I mean, ain't going to be no coup now. They know who the people are going to be. Well, that wasn't the case. They're so blatant that they went ahead with it anyway. Was I alone in thinking that? No. Vladimir Putin apparently thought the same thing because he stayed in Sochi at the Winter Olympics until he had to come back the day after the coup. Now, what did he do on the day after the coup? Well, obviously, he convened his top national security advisors, and he said, well, what are we going to do about our only ice-free, year-long naval base in Sevastopol? And they said, well, that's in Crimea. If they're going to join NATO, we're not going to let them take Crimea. And so there was a plebiscite. The Crimeans overwhelmingly voted to rejoin Russia. And that's why Crimea became annexed to Russia. Main point here, there is not a scintilla. There's no evidence at all that it ever entered Putin's mind to annex Crimea before the coup on the 22nd of February 2014. Now, that's just the beginning. It goes downhill from there, but those were the key things. And what American people, by and large, don't know, because the media doesn't tell them, is that there was this coup. It was right on the doorstep of Russia, and they threatened to join NATO. And besides that, they had emplacements for the kinds of capsules that can handle not only anti-ballistic missiles, but also things like Tomahawk cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles. So there's not only a rhetorical or strategic threat, there's a tactical threat where Putin has made it clear, has made it very obvious that he doesn't want these kinds of missiles on his doorstep, which would give him, well, he said it himself at the end of December, it would give him 7 to 10 minutes warning time if it were a slow-moving Tomahawk missiles before it reached Moscow. And if it were a hypersonic missile, it would give them 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world. I mean, that's what it comes to, really, okay? He didn't want that. And so he tried to negotiate and said, look, we don't want these things right on our periphery. It's very, very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had its denouement, which had its peak.
Professor Sachs, we know that from the Cuban Missile Crisis, we know that President Kennedy, I think when he feels existential threat in his backyard in Cuba, why Putin cannot feel an existential threat at his doorstep in Ukraine?
It's very analogous that when Fidel Castro in 1960, after the Cuban Revolution, turned to the Soviet Union, it did not take long, by the way, for Eisenhower first to say, okay, now we invade Cuba. Because immediately the CIA put together a plan to invade Cuba, because Cuba, with a military alliance with the Soviet Union, hell no. So the United States, of course, by the way, if Mexico announced one day, we really like China and we're entering a military alliance with China, and Washington says Ukraine can make whatever choice it wants, so we want to make whatever choice we want. It would probably be a war in 20 minutes. The United States would never tolerate it, the U.S. government, that is. But we can't understand the red lines of other countries because the U.S. is a very arrogant country. You know, when you're so powerful, you think the rules apply only to the others, not to you, or whatever, or that you don't have to, what you feel doesn't matter for anyone else. And so there's a kind of arrogance built into this, which is that what the U.S. would never tolerate, it expects other countries to accede to. And Putin said, no, you know, this is my backyard, Russia's backyard. We don't accept NATO here. And more to the point, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union, after the U.S. invasion of Cuba, responded by Khrushchev putting offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, which was a very reckless thing. But Khrushchev wanted to teach the Americans a lesson. He wanted to say, you have missiles pointed at us in Turkey, we will have missiles pointed at you in Cuba. You invade Cuba, we'll defend Cuba. So Khrushchev was trying to do politics in this way, but in a very clumsy way. As soon as it was discovered that those missiles were there in mid-October 1962, everybody in the U.S. leadership said, well, we've got to go to war. And Kennedy organized an executive committee to consider the options. And everybody said, okay, well, the only decision is it war on Thursday or war on Saturday or war on Monday? You know, how do we get ready for war? But Kennedy kept saying to himself, why did Khrushchev do this? Why did Khrushchev do this? What's in his mind? I need to think of this from his point of view. And this was really brilliant, extremely important. It ended up saving the world. Kennedy had one advisor at the beginning, Adlai Stevenson, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, who said to Kennedy, you have to end this diplomatically. Kennedy was shocked because every other advisor had said, you have to end this militarily. And Kennedy was also very politically conscious. You know, he's a political animal. He said, if I don't respond to this in a tough way, I'm going to be impeached. I'm certainly going to pay a heavy political price. So on the one hand, he was told, go in and bomb. He knew something wasn't right about that. He was quite afraid politically for his own circumstances if he looked too soft on this. And that's why crises like these are so unbelievably dangerous. And incidentally, the CIA had correctly spotted these missile sites in Cuba with the air surveillance, the so-called U-2 spy planes, but they were wrong on so many details. They said the missiles weren't yet in operation, but many were. They said there were about 5,000 Soviet troops, but it was closer to 40,000. So many things that they thought were true were false. And the premise of how the U.S. would militarily engage was based on lots of false premises, which is also par for the course. And the reason I mention it is we've got a war going on that's a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia right now in Ukraine. It's extraordinarily dangerous. We shouldn't think, well, they're keeping it under control. Yeah, it's terrible for the Ukrainians, but nothing too bad can happen. As long as this war goes on, something absolutely terrible can happen. Absolutely terrible. Even a field commander, often has authority to use a tactical nuclear weapon or something, or an accident happens, or somebody misreads a radar signal, or God knows what kind of thing can happen. Miscalculation is par for the course in a crisis like this, which is why I'm insisting every day we need to negotiate this. We need to understand that NATO enlargement crossed a red line very dangerously. Putin told us that repeatedly for a dozen years. We refused to listen out of arrogance. Now we have a war going on. Now we need to find a diplomatic way out, and quickly, before terrible accidents happen.
60 years ago, exactly today, on the 28th of October, 1962. What do I mean? I mean that Khrushchev backed down. He said, well, we tried to put missiles in Cuba. Kennedy is threatening nuclear war. Let's get out of here. What do? Well, we get Kennedy to promise not to invade Cuba, and then we say, okay, well, we won. The U.S. is not going to invade Cuba. We can pull the missiles out. He backed down. Now, why did he back down? Because he saw that Kennedy saw an existential threat. An existential threat if medium-range ballistic missiles were placed in Cuba. They were already there. Were the nuclear warheads there? Yes, we know now. We didn't know then. How far could they reach? Not only Washington, D.C., but Omaha, Nebraska, where our Strategic Air Command was. This was an existential threat. Now, Khrushchev, when he conferred with his, we know a lot about this now because we have the Soviet documents that have been released. He said, well, it's not an existential threat for us. It was a good try, right? It was a gambit. It didn't work. Are we going to risk nuclear war for this? No, let's just pull the missiles out and say we extracted a promise the United States would not invade Cuba. Now, why do I mention that now? Not only because it's the 60th anniversary exactly, but because Putin, like President Kennedy, sees an existential threat from these missile emplacements already in Romania, going into Poland, almost finished there, and didn't want them in Ukraine as well. Now, did he get satisfaction from the U.S. that this wouldn't happen? No, and that's a long story. The U.S. people don't know this very much because they don't follow what people say as closely as I do. But if you're interested, I can show you how Putin in December raised issues specifically with Joseph Biden, our president, and Biden promised. Get this, folks. Biden promised on the 30th of December in a telephone call or Zoom or whatever it was with Putin. And the readout from that telephone call was, quote, Mr. Biden said that the U.S. had no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. The Russians were delighted with this. They said our negotiations, which were about to begin in Geneva, are off to a very good start. This is a big, big, good step. Guess what? Somebody got to the president and said, Joe, my God, did you really say that to Putin? He said, well, yeah. Well, forget about it, Joe. We're not going to do that. And so the negotiators were not allowed to even mention the president's promise not to deploy offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, Putin is watching all this, and the next time he talks to Biden, the readout is Biden did not mention anything about not deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine as he had 6 weeks prior on December the 30th. What is Putin to think? Well, number one, who's running the show in Washington? And number two, can I trust these people? Well, he decided he couldn't. And with the support of China, which is a very major factor here, he decided that he had to invade Ukraine. Now, people say to me, Ray, you're not condoning, you're not saying that it's okay to invade another country. No, that's not what an intelligence analyst does. An intelligence analyst tries to figure out why. Why did Putin do this? Okay. And as I watch the assurances that Putin sought, the promise that he didn't get, and the threat not only of continuing destruction of these Russian speakers outside of Russia, namely in Ukraine, but also the prospect of this NATO-trained army, NATO-trained in the past 7 years, attacking Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk, which it appears they were about to do. I think that I can understand, okay? I can understand why Putin decided the only solution here is for me to clean these guys out and take back Donetsk and Lugansk and see what else happens. Do I have allies in this? I do. Xi Jinping, he couldn't pick a better ally, and so he went ahead. So people say to me, McGovern, shall you think that's all right? Look, what I say to them is this. I think Putin, like any president, considers his main duty and first and foremost duty to defend his country from outside aggression. I have to say we give him that. That is a major objective of his reckoning. So here's McGovern. Why don't we try to be a little empathetic here and put ourselves in Putin's shoes, okay? And I watch all this activity going back to the coup in Kiev, 2014, and I see the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to the east, despite promises in the past not to do that. So what's the bottom line for me? I say to my friends, no. I don't want to be a hypocrite. Hypocrites are not nice people. So if I was sure, well, let me put it this way. If I were Putin, I'm not sure what I would have done. When you're president of a country and you see an existential threat, and you have the power and the potential to react to that threat, that's what you do. That's what John Kennedy did on Cuba. Was the blockade legal? No. Was his assembly of an invasion force prepared to go into Cuba legal? Not so much. Was his threatening of nuclear war legal? Well, UN says you're not supposed to do that. But nobody said, Mr. Kennedy, what you're trying to do is unprovoked. It was provoked. And that's the way I look at Vladimir Putin. I think that when we have to be honest here and say that we provoked him into these measures. And you can talk about the morality, you can talk about how terrible it is that people are suffering. I feel really bad about that. I honestly do. But the corollary here is that if you want to stop this, if you want to have a ceasefire, and you have an imbalance of power in that area of the world where the Russians have most of the power, then you got to figure out why they did it. Okay, why Putin? What motivated Putin to do this? And once you figure that out, then you can meet and negotiate. For God's sake, that's the way we used to do it, and that's precisely the way we did it on Cuba. And there are no high-level contacts worth mentioning now that things have gotten so bad between Russia and the United States.